Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming here. I'd like to welcome you to Sharm El Sheikh, to the AIIB Annual Meeting, and also to this session. We've started about 15 minutes late because this room wasn't available earlier. So what we'll do is we'll try to end within an hour, so end the discussion within an hour. So we'll end this session around 3:15, which was the scheduled time. My name is Najib Haider. I am Director General of Banking Region 2 at AIIB. And it's my honor and pleasure to be here with this eminent panel. What I'd like to do is give you a quick overview of this session and then introduce the panelists and then request the panelists to introduce the topic to yourselves. The topic is innovation in infrastructure and private equity. We are an Asian-focused bank. The sector in Asia is fast moving. There's numerous innovative financing structures that are evolving and that are being tested as we speak. Private equity investments are part of AIIB's mandate and a great opportunity to bring private equity managers and investors together to mobilize private capital for infrastructure. Private capital mobilization is also AIIB's one of 4 thematic priorities. Over the past 7 years, AIIB has partnered with reputable managers that have a track record in infrastructure investment. We have also partnered with investors who have thematic investment approaches to infrastructure, all in AIIB member countries. We have the privilege of convening this panel, and we are hoping that this session will be a great opportunity to call on all the experiences that these eminent panelists have had in their areas of specialization. I will start by introducing the panelists, and to my immediate left, Mr. Sadiq Wahba. He is the founder, chairman, and managing partner of I2 Capital. I2 specializes in infrastructure investments in the energy, utilities, transport, environmental infra, digital infra, and social infra sectors globally. It's almost like the AIIB mandate, Sadiq. Sadiq was previously the CEO of Morgan Stanley Infrastructure. Also, as a former economist at the World Bank, Sadiq was part of the expert committee on the World Economic Forum's first report on global infrastructure investments, and was named Global Infrastructure Personality of the Year twice, as well as Global Infrastructure Personality of the Decade by Private Equity International in September 2022. President Biden appointed Sadiq to the National Infrastructure Advisory Council, which advises the White House on reducing the physical and cyber risks and improving the security and resilience of critical infrastructure in the US. The next panelist to Sadiq's left is Ms. Jennifer Buckley, the founder and managing director of the Southeast Asia Women's Economic Empowerment Fund, or SWEEF Capital. Jennifer founded SWEEF Capital as an independent firm in mid-2021, having led the Asia and Women's Economic Empowerment Investment Programs, a small Enterprise Assistance Fund, SEAF, since 2018. SWEEF was founded in response to a major shift that recognizes the power of women taking charge of their futures, which can unlock significant new value. Jennifer has 2 decades of private equity leadership experience focused on growing mid-sized businesses across Europe and Asia, including with GE Capital, private advisors Goldman Sachs. SWEEF was also recognized as the top 30 innovations in ESG impact in 2020 Private Equity International Awards. Also to left of Jennifer, it's our honor to have from the AIIB's International Advisory Panel, Mr. Jose Isidro Camacho, Nito as we call him, former Secretary of Finance and former Secretary of Energy of the Philippines. Mr. Camacho is the chairman of Sun Life of Canada in the Philippines, the largest life insurance company in the country, and is the chairman of the University of the Arts, Singapore. He's also a senior advisor and board director to several corporate groups in Asia. He was previously the vice chairman for Credit Suisse, Asia Pacific, until December 2022. Mr. Camacho joined Credit Suisse in March 2005 after his distinguished career in government and international banking. He was Secretary of Finance for the Philippines. Prior to that, Mr. Camacho was the Secretary of Energy for the Philippines. Prior to joining the government, he worked with the Deutsche Bank in the Philippines, with Bankers Trust, and has over 22 years of international banking experience in New York, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Manila, and Singapore. Mr. Camacho obtained his bachelor's degree in mathematics, cum laude from La Salle University in 1975. He received his MBA with concentration in finance from Harvard University in 1979. In 2017, Mr. Camacho was awarded an honorary degree of Doctor of Business Administration from Eastern Asia University, Thailand. And one of our hosts, to my extreme left, Mr. Don Ickley. Don is leading the Banking Region 1 department as Director General. The department focuses on private equity, financial intermediaries, structured products, capital markets, ICT, and other productive sectors. Before joining AIIB, Don was corporate advisor for Temasek from 2008 to 2013. He was the chief investment officer and head of alternative investments at Korea Investment Corporation. Prior to that, he spent 5 years as head of investments at STIC Investments. Don started his professional career in IFC, Washington, D.C., and was there from 1987 to 1997. With that series of introductions, I would like to invite Sadek to start his discussion and give some opening remarks. Sadek, over to you.
Thank you, Najib, and thank you very much. Thank you, Najib, and thank you for the introduction. And thank you for Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank for hosting us today. You've done an absolutely amazing job, and of course, thanks to the Egyptian government for organizing that event. I was asked to frame up a little bit the conversation that we're going to have today, and so I put a couple of pages so that we can have a comprehensive conversation around the topic that we're going to be discussing. So the first thing which I think we're all fully aware of, but I think it's always important to remind ourselves, is that investing in infrastructure has a huge impact on economic growth. Believe it or not, some people in the past have questioned whether that is the case. And so I wanted to highlight a study done by the Asia Infrastructure Bank, where they actually are able to produce in a thorough economic model showing the clear relationship between the impact that investing in infrastructure has on economic growth. On that graph, you see the investment as a percentage of GDP. China, for example, has had one of the highest numbers in the world. As a small parenthesis, the US has had historically, since the 1970s, less than 2% as a percentage of GDP, which explains a little bit why, for example, the Biden administration was very keen on investing in infrastructure and reversing that trend, because there was a realization that investing in infrastructure in the right way leads to economic growth. This is a scatter diagram from that study, and I would urge you to look on the website of the AIIB, because you'll see that study, and I mentioned that in particular, as I said, because of the economic model that they were able to develop is one of the more robust one that you have out there in the academic literature. So you can see that as investing in, as a percentage of GDP, you can see the GDP growth on a 5-year average is positively sloped, okay? But the value of that study is that it was able to demonstrate the correlation in the right direction, that infrastructure leads to economic growth, not vice versa. So when we hear that, so we have to understand a little bit what kind of economic investment we need to do in infrastructure. And the truth is, not all infrastructure are created equal, and in a way, at the foundation of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, its purpose was really to focus on infrastructure and the kind of sustainable infrastructure that would lead to long-term economic growth. Key things to keep in mind. $100 billion investing in infrastructure, properly done, can boost GDP by another $150 billion or more. That, by the way, is a statistic in the case of the US. I mention that because the multiplier effect for large industrial economies tend to be lower than multiplier effect for emerging markets, which should be significantly higher. For $1 invested in infrastructure, you can get $1.50 or even more and create up to $1 million of employment. So the impact of infrastructure done right. The second element is, as you invest more in infrastructure, we have diminishing marginal returns. So how can we sustain that? And that is a little bit the topic of our conversation today, which is to find ways in which we can have sustainable infrastructure both from an environmental perspective, but sustainable in the economic sense, that we can continue to invest in it in a way that effectively leads to a multiplier effect. We are here because the AIIB is a multilateral institution. So the question is, how can we leverage that? And that was, in fact, part of the panel that we had this morning, which is what can be the role of multilaterals. When you look at it from the private equity perspective, and we had a few people from the private equity on the panel, including the CEO of one of the major construction companies in Egypt that has invested heavily in infrastructure, you can see there is a plethora of both multilateral institutions as well as development finance institutions, which are basically state-based. The question is, how do you navigate through all of these institutions, which all have their own systems, their own criteria, their own underwriting? They have their own internal processes. Some of it is financial, some of it is economic, some of it is political. Why political? Because they may not have the funding from their parliament to be able to do it on time. So there's a whole issues of associated with working with all these institutions that we, from a private equity perspective, need to navigate. One simple example is, how do you go about investing in a project that requires an environmental impact assessment study when each one of them asks you for a different type of study, right? How can we coordinate that effort? That is an important element that we keep in mind. The size of the investments that private capital can bring is enormous. There's about $1 trillion that needs to be invested in infrastructure every year to maintain economic growth rates that we currently have now, not just to increase them. Of that, 167 billion comes from the private sector and 6 billion comes from multilateral. So the question is, that 6 billion on an absolute basis looks as if it's small, but with leverage, and I don't mean leverage in terms of just debt, I mean in terms of the impact it can do, that can have a huge multiplier effect, as we heard from the panel this morning. What are the challenges that we from a private capital face? One, identifying projects. Can we find the projects? Are they bankable? Do they make economic sense? Two, structure and regulation. We heard that from the Minister of Finance from Indonesia. I think she was very eloquent in the way she said it. The main role is to provide a regulatory framework that encourages people to come and invest. Capital markets, again, a topic that we heard today. I was talking to the person responsible for the electricity sector in Egypt. He said we need to have long-term PPAs, many of them in dollars, because there is no capital market in Egypt that can finance it in Egyptian pounds. And we have here someone who's invested in solar project, part of the AIIB project, and knows that very well. Four is quantify financial risk, FX risk, local versus currency financing, which we talked about. I put in here, and I don't know if this would work. No. I put in here the ease of doing business index. I put Australia because it's a developed market and the ease of doing business is 1, and I put Guatemala. I have to confess I was going to put Egypt, but I thought that may not be politically correct. So I decided not to include Egypt, not to embarrass anyone. But I put Guatemala, and the only reason I put Guatemala is because we just, as part of my company, we just sold the largest electric distribution company in Guatemala. Over 5 years, we invested in it, we sold it, we worked with the IFC on that, and you can see that Guatemala has 5, which is on a scale of 1 to 5 is the highest. The point being that depending on the economy, there are places in which you can invest and others where it may take time. The role of AIIB is to be able to give you not only a stamp of approval, but also to be able to say, we've invested in that region, we will work with you to mitigate some of that risks. So when we think of financing for tomorrow, there are 4 things that the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, as I understand it, are really focusing on. Green infrastructure, connectivity and regional cooperation, private capital mobilization, and technology-enabled infrastructure. So I'll say 2 seconds on each. When it comes to green infrastructure, personally, as an American and someone who invests in infrastructure,
I cannot but acknowledge the extraordinary work that AIIB has done in that area. So for example, we've been involved with them on investing 1,000 megawatts in Malaysia, Philippines, India. So there's a whole amount that is being invested in this case through Hexa, which is a company in which AIIB has invested alongside I2 Capital. And I should say, alongside the Development Finance Corporation of the United States. So there's a lot of area of cooperation and connectivity we can do. The second is connectivity. Agreco is an interesting example in which, again, AIIB has invested in through our funds. It's investing in 48 emerging market economies and producing 5,000 megawatts of mobile power generation. So these are mobile power that is used for industrial sites, for stadiums, for constructions, and so on and so forth. We're moving towards green by moving away from gas into renewable and adding batteries to it. So it's an extraordinary thing, and that is in large part pushed by organizations like the AIIB that have very high environmental standards. Private capital mobilization, they've invested, I can name 3 funds here, 1, 2, and 3 that I can recognize at least, in which AIIB has invested directly. In the case of I2 Capital, interestingly, their commitment on a $3 billion fund is 150 million. That has enabled us to put 2.5 billion of deployable capital, which itself is generating 4.5 billion of debt through Indian, Taiwanese, Colombian, Brazilian, Canadian, UK, US, Spanish banks. That is the power of leverage that you can see from the investments that you can have through AIIB. Kotak and Kipel are 2 examples that they've already invested in funds. Last but not least, technology-enabled infrastructure, investing in data centers in Southeast Asia. When we talk about connectivity between this and fiber optic, I can't find of a better example. And then when you think about technology, think of the entire urban ecosystem that we live in today. For the first time in humanity, more than 50% of the population is in urban areas. Over the coming decade, 80% of the growth is going to come from Asia. Of that, 80% is going to come from urban areas. So how do we develop technology-enabled infrastructure, which is a main theme of AIIB and frankly of ours, is extremely important and critical to include. I'll skip that one just because of time, but thank you very much, and we look into the panel.
Thank you, Savik. That was a very interesting introduction to the topic. You covered very important factors that we consider in our day-to-day activities at AIIB as well. If you add to that the macroeconomic difficulties that the world is facing, we spoke in the earlier panel, inaugural panel, we spoke about the slowing down of GDP globally. I'd like to turn to Jennifer. How do you, in this environment, how do you, you're raising growth capital, how do you think AIIB is contributing, and how do you think MDBs could facilitate people like yourselves in your fundraising and deployment activities?
Thank you. The mic's on. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to AIIB and the Egyptian government for allowing me to be here today. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Sweep Capital is a growth investor, so we invest in SMEs in Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, with sectors of focus being healthcare, education, food-related sectors, and climate resilience. Because we're a growth capital investor, it means we're very much investing in the SMEs in these countries, which is very important when a significant part of the economic development of these markets is driven by their SME base. And that SME base and its growth is very reliant in the infrastructure that AIIB, as part of its wider mandate, is building through communications infrastructure, transportation, logistics, and other areas. And as well, those SMEs have a critical role to play in allowing us to maximize that infrastructure across these countries. So very much what AIIB is seeking to do in the region is critically linked to the ability for SWEEP to work with these companies to drive our returns. From the perspective of SWEEP, we're very much seen as an impact investment, sustainability-oriented fund. We're known globally for our focus on women's economic empowerment and the ability to leverage diversity as a value driver within business. And we've developed a particular methodology in that area. When it comes to private sector, the sustainability and impact investing is an area that is growing, notwithstanding the increasingly difficult fundraising situation that we've had over the last couple of years. Sustainability and impact is an area that institutions are continuing to invest in. And AIIB has played a critical role in SWIFT's ability to raise our fund. Our fund is seen as new, it's niche, it's innovative, it's one of the few funds in this area globally. But through having an investment from AIIB, it's supported our ability to attract money from European pension plans, working with the Australian government, who was an earlier investor, and involved with AIIB as well, but also attracting money from family offices around the world, from the UK, Switzerland, Canada, and Australia. And what those investors and institutions have valued about the fact that AIIB is in the fund is in a few areas. AIIB, as a bank, is known for its strength in climate finance. That's something that's a critical focus for the private sector institutions. Also, the MBBs have a role to play in standard settings within impact and sustainability. It's such a new area that the frameworks associated with how funds are measured and how we should think about impact targets within our portfolio is still being developed. So being able to work with the MBB to set those standards and to give the credibility that the private sector needs around the measurement that we're doing as a fund manager is very important.
Thank you, Jennifer. Sadiq, if I could just quickly come back to you. One of the 4 priorities you mentioned was private capital mobilization. Can you just quick thoughts on how MDBs could do this better?
No?
Yeah, the issue that I mentioned before is at the end of the day a coordination among MDBs, which I think is a key element. Each one has the ability to do some amount, which in and of itself is valuable, but does not have the scale unless you're the World Bank or UIFC or other institutions. The World Bank was created in the aftermath of World War II as part of the Bretton Woods, and there have been other institutions created, but none of the scale of the World Bank until 2015, which is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was created. One, in my view, the advantages of a bank like the AIIB is its scale and the ability to, having learned from the good things and the bad things that will happen through multilateral development institutions over the last 40 plus years. It would have been even better if more countries had joined, and I'm sure that may happen over the years. But that, I think, is the critical element. So what is it that we need to see today? I think a much better coordination among institutions. I give you one simple example. For someone who's investing in emerging markets and infrastructure, when we come to do a project, you need to do an environmental assessment impact. Okay, every criteria, every assessment study has different criteria for every institution. No institution will accept the others. Now, maybe 70% of the input is the same, but no one is going to say, okay, you've done it with the IFC, I'm okay with it, automatically. Not going to happen. So in these elements, one of the things that we were talking about in the morning panel was the fact that some of these institutions take way too long to be able to do that. From the time that we make an investment and we actually close it and we invite a DFI to join, it can take 12 months. So let me ask you, for the existing investors who put money in that investment, why would they let someone come in at cost 12 to 14 months later? It's not possible. So that, in a way, reduces the impact of these institutions. I think you need to be able to have a model where there is a huge amount of cooperation, huge amount of leverage among them, so you're able to effectively have a much bigger impact for the capital that MDBs provide.
Thank you. We've heard from two eminent private equity practitioners. Dito, if I could come to you, you advise the AIIB as a member of the International Advisory Panel. You have excellent private sector experience and you have excellent public sector experience. So from a government perspective, how do you think projects or sponsors of projects could approach MDBs better or approach AIIB better in terms of successfully raising funding?
Sorry, Najib, can you please?
So I think from a government perspective, how do you think sponsors of projects could better approach multilateral development banks to be more efficient and more effectively raise funding for their projects?
Okay. From a government perspective, and I'm going to repeat myself because this question was somewhat asked in a different way this morning, and I think everyone here was present. I think the governments need to provide the proper investment environment that would attract private investors like iSquare Capital and others. MDBs have a very important role in encouraging governments to do that. I think this morning issues like ease of doing business were mentioned, level playing field, having investment policies that are not only clear but stable, predictable, and implemented in an equal way. That's not always the case in many economies, and I think governments have to do a better job in doing that. Specific to infrastructure, especially in terms of marrying public capital and private capital, the establishment of things like PPPs programs, I think is very helpful in the promotion of these programs, but also in providing clarity as to how things will work, the guidelines, and which sectors are more attractive than others, from both the government as well as the private capital perspective. I think a very important mandate as well, and I alluded to my response this morning, is helping build the capital markets domestically that could support infrastructure longer term, because infrastructure to be sustainable cannot just rely on foreign capital coming in. There are natural mismatches, foreign exchange, maturities, and so on, and only a deep local capital markets would be able to sustain financing for infrastructure in a local economy, in a domestic economy. And there are many ways of doing that. I mentioned one possible way, which is creating an equity capital instrument that's specific to infrastructure. It's being done in some economies, but very few economies, and it requires the establishment of the legal framework to allow it. It requires the development of institutional investors within a country, pension funds, insurance companies, family offices, and the like, to be able to build that liquidity into a domestic capital market. So I think the interplay between governments, MDBs, and the private sector, both strategic as well as financial investors, is critical.
Thank you, and I agree. I think so. Everything you said in the morning and what you've just elaborated now as well, Philippines is one of the few countries in the Asia-Pacific region that has a very successful PPP construct in the power sector. And what makes it work is the ingredients that you mentioned, right? So you have to have a regulatory regime, a set of legal contracts that work, open, transparent bidding process. You invite equity, and once you have the equity, then the debt will come in. And all of this is premised on an appropriate allocation of risk amongst the parties that should be bearing them. So I think that's all very relevant. And also what you mentioned about local currencies is very important. Historically, wherever there's been an issue with infrastructure projects, it's usually related to FX risk and construction risk as well, but usually it's FX risk. So local currency funding is extremely important for local currency generating projects. So thank you very much for that. You said something about construction risk in the morning, but I think you and I should discuss that separately. It's a very interesting, very elaborate subject, so we'll do that separately, not in this panel. Don, if I may come to you, AIIB has been investing in equity since 2016, so it's a little over 7 years. Can you let us know what you think AIIB has achieved over the past 7 years?
Sure. Thank you, Najib. In fact, I mean, the charge of the banking department, and in fact, me and Najib split the region, you know, in the Asian regions, so to two, but we are doing the same thing. One of the business area is private equity. So now we are talking about private equity today. You know, why we do the private equity? The MDB, we are still young stage. So we got a lot of questions about that. But I strongly believe this is the way to mobilize, you know, the private sector mobilizing capital and making a positive impact in the infrastructure area in Asia. So why equity? You know, equity is not typical one. MDB does like the World Bank and other, you know, I assume, right? Again, we believe the equity brings the biggest multiplier effect, because you know, you can imagine if you put the equity into certain, you know, projects or companies, the normally 70-30 ratio will attract 70 of debt financing, and if you go through the funds, then you're going to bring a lot of diversified portfolios, and again, that's we call kind of a multiplier effect. So we partner with many number of like-minded managers, such as we see the I-Square Capital and SHICC Capital. We are very happy working with them. Throughout the years, it's been 7 years now, and I think we believe we have internal capacity has been growing significantly. In fact, with the first investment made was 2017, which is only 1 year after our establishment, which is not the easy case. The typical MDBs does that early stage. We started private equity. How and why? Because we have a very strong top management support, and we do believe this is one of the best way to mobilize capital. And at the same time, we have a strong commitment to the private sector business, and we all know the private equity plays one of the important role. Okay, I'd like to share with you all this information. You have a transparent is all in our website, but to summary, we have up to now about 33 fund investments were approved by the board since 2017, and typical check size between 30 million to 100 million, and we have a core investment sleeves, so we could be a little bit vary, but that's kind of a sweet spot of our activities in private equity. And you know, I can come back a little bit later, but we're also pleased to launch so-called venture capital investment platform approved by the board end of last year, and supporting the infrastructure development, the early stage in the areas. Again, but even I said that when I was in the previous in the sovereign wealth fund, the approach is very different. The sovereign wealth fund normally takes a risk return approach first, but here we have to take care of all these mandate and our impact makings and regulations. So that other than that, we're still taking we're dealing with the emerging markets in Asia. So which means even if we do with this kind of mandate, the private equity, still we take market risk. Okay, so same as other investor to expect the return based on the given risk. And as I said, the impacts has to be aligned with AIIB's core mandate. And again, a lot of cases we even anchor coming to the first investor as a catalytic role, hopefully to attract other investors. The equity investment also serves as the essential risk capital to create markets and drive innovation. As I said, I'd like to touch upon briefly about the newly launched the venture capital investment.
this is some kind, it's kind of an internal fund of funds facility. So if you deal with a small size of venture capital, typically $5, $10, $15 million per fund, we don't have any small fund all the way to the board. So we have a package approval by the board of a $100 million facility. So within that, we can go out and make a diversification of early stage, mostly in the digital infrastructure area, early stage. We hope to make, let's say, 12 to 15 small scale venture capital, a total amount of $130 million, including the $30 million follow-on co-investment suite for the next 3 years. So if this program goes very, as we expected, then we can increase our capacity down the road. So I hope I explained a brief impression of our program now. So thank you.
Actually, the conversation and as opposed to a Q&A from you, Najib, do you mind? No problem. No, I just want to play devil's advocate a little bit. I think it's quite remarkable and impressive that AIIB has gotten into venture capital, as Don was saying.
I was going to ask you about venture capital, but you preempted, so that's good.
But it does beg the question as to what venture capital, how it relates to infrastructure. Because most venture capital that I know, in the private sector, are really geared towards segments that don't necessarily associate itself with infrastructure, mostly consumer, retail, tech, fintechs, apps, the development of apps, and so on and so forth. And I wonder how the bank justifies an investment in venture capital and relate it to its main mission, which is the development of infrastructure. I think that infrastructure for the AIIB is defined very widely, not just physical infrastructure, but a lot of social infrastructure in health, in education, and so on. But I just wonder how the AIIB deals with it, how downstream on your team, when you look at venture capital investments, how do you look at venture capital funds that are actually consistent with the AIIB mandate?
So I'll start responding to that, and Don, if you'd like to add. So that's a very good question, Lito. And as you said, traditionally venture capital funds, although they're high on impact and creativity, because they're very early stage equity investments, they usually focus on the more consumer type sectors. What we're looking at is infrastructure focused venture capital funds. So we are, of course, very, very selective. And our mandate for infrastructure includes the frontiers of innovation on the digital infrastructure side. So digital infrastructure projects that venture capital usually is very, it's a good fit. We look at those. One of the first, in fact, probably the first investment we've done is in that sphere of digitally enhanced infrastructure. Also, what sometimes classifies as venture capital is not just the nature of the underlying investment, it's also the geography. So sometimes venture capitalists venture into markets that are very frontier in nature. So us as a multilateral development bank, we are more comfortable taking the country type risks of our members than commercial parties could be. So it's different factors, but one is that, the geography. So the country risk that we are better able to assess and take if it's a member country, which is otherwise considered high risk or a frontier market. And also infrastructure sectors that relate to the more innovative, not the traditional, but the more innovative types of infrastructure that is now being developed. So now even data centers has become pretty standard. But there are technologies around data centers that are innovative. There's technologies around logistics that are innovative. And so we're looking at those and supporting those very selectively, of course. Thank you.
Maybe if I may also to answer the question. 10 years from now, the way we think of infrastructure, in my view, and it may be earlier than 10 years, will have fundamentally changed. Technology has been late to be adopted by infrastructure sectors, as opposed to, say, the consumer sector, right? And we don't need to talk about that because we will see it and live with every day. And one of the reasons infrastructure has been late in adopting technology is because, of course, it is a regulated sector where you are looking for
well-defined cash flows, and there is a PPP or a PPA or a government regulation that tells you this is the cash flow you're going to get over the coming 10 years, and therefore there is very little incentive in that model for innovation. That is completely being upended. Transport and logistics today must use IoT technology to be able to transfer boxes. In one of our companies, which is the largest logistics company in Europe, called CIP, we're using AI for that purpose. That technology was developed, interestingly, outside of infrastructure, but one of its main applications was infrastructure. You're talking of cybersecurity, a guy who does ransomware on your computer, but there is now, of course, risk associated with operational technology, which is the physical operation of the asset itself. That is core to infrastructure. That is a development which is not typically associated with infrastructure, yet it is absolutely critical for infrastructure. So today, people have to invest in those kind of technologies, and to the extent that this is what AIIB is doing, that's extremely valuable.
I think just quickly, I'll just give one example that may highlight need to request respond to your question in a case study kind of format. So we invested in a company that is a leader in artificial intelligence in China and also globally. And the fund we invested jointly with them in, what they do is they use their proprietary AI technology to make operations-heavy companies more efficient. And by doing that, they increase their profitability and economic value, and therefore the fund hopefully will do well. But that's just an example of the kinds of projects that we're looking at. Sorry, go ahead. Jennifer?
Yeah, I just wanted to add another example picking up on what colleagues were saying from the SWIFT perspective when we're thinking about social infrastructure. So one of the companies that we've invested in Vietnam focuses on providing innovation education for children coming through in Vietnam. So they have their own centers, but now the Vietnam government has adopted a new education framework that means that any child in Vietnam should have access to 2 hours of innovation education a week. Now, the difficulty in trying to deliver that through a public school system is twofold. One is, where do you get the money from to actually put that type of equipment in every public school across Vietnam? But the other one is actually, what stand in the way of that happening globally is that there aren't enough teachers available today that have knowledge of how to teach innovation. And what we mean by innovation is not just coding. We're talking about robotics. We're talking about AI, 3D design, engineering aspects to it. So, and thinking about even climate transition, we need the children of today to come through with those skill sets for the future of our workforce going forward. So in order to do that, the company has built a very, they're very focused on the platform that they've built that both supports the tracking of what's happening from educational outcomes perspectives with children, but also with the teachers. So it's actually through that platform that is enabling this to be delivered in a way that is bringing forward the depth of knowledge of innovation within the Vietnam public school system. So that kind of infrastructure is quite critical to the economic development in these countries.
Thank you, Jen. Najib, if I may just speak to the comments made, because I buy the point that there are early stage investments that are VC in nature and can be very much related to infrastructure, through technology, through the social infrastructure that Jennifer was mentioning. The problem that I'm still having is because the bank today has been investing in VC fund managers, not directly in those VC ventures that you're talking about. So in a way, you're reliant that the investment strategy, the theme, and the processes that those VC fund managers are consistent with the mission of the bank. I think it's different if the bank was making those direct investments in the examples that you mentioned, but if it's being intermediated by fund managers who may or may not share the same vision, or who may invest in some of those, but in many others, how does the bank influence, you know, the investment decisions that are being made by the fund managers that you're investing in?
So, Leo, that's a very good question. So I think so.
I hate to be the moderator because you are the
No,
moderator.
it's okay. It's okay, but it's an AIB session, so I like talking about AIB, and as I'm sure Don does. So I think I'm getting the opportunity to talk about AIB, so that's good. So I think first of all, we select managers who are like-minded. So that's the starting point. The other thing that we think we add value with is when we work with fund managers, we work with them on the condition that they follow our system. So in terms of procurement, in terms of environmental and social risk management, in terms of not only deal selection, but also in terms of deal monitoring. So that's the way we work. So that's an optionless situation. We either have that cooperation or we don't. If we have that cooperation, we develop a partnership and we work forward. And if we don't, then we give it a pass. And actually, interestingly, in the private equity venture capital space, we have a lot more inquiry that we can actually proceed with. So it's not a question of whether there's enough inquiry coming our way. It's a question of who do we select as a partner that we want to work with on a long-term basis. We're in the long-term business, so we don't want to do a deal and then move on. We want to develop a partnership that grows over time.
Would you usually have co-investment rights with your fund managers so that if you really like the venture capital, you know, the investee company, that the bank would?
We do.
Not
always, but many of our funds we do. And I think you mentioned in the morning as well that we need to be focused more on direct equity, and that's in line with our equity strategy that we intended to start with fund investments, but over time do more and more direct equity investments as well. Don, would you like to add?
Right. Thank you. Supplementing the Victor's comments and questions, I'd like to clarify first of all, what is infrastructure? You know, people. You know, it's evolving. Even the latest trend is, when you talk about infrastructure like 10 years ago, very conventional infrastructure such as energy, transportation, water, urban. Those are the kind of big areas. Now we expand digital infrastructure such as communication and satellite, even you know, e-commerce, data centers, all kinds of new technologies could be regarded as infrastructure. And recently, the bank added social infrastructure, which is again the education and hospital, medical. So, in fact, even we call Asian investment, you know, the infrastructure investment bank, other than pure manufacturing or financial services, pretty much fall into the broader sense of infrastructure, because the connectivity is there, a green infrastructure there. There's a very wide. That's one thing I want to kind of clarify. Second, the why we do infrastructure, the venture capital seems like a lot of interest is kind of two reasons, because we are ongoing long-term investor, so we have to put that position in the all the different segments and the stages of capital development. We have a mid-cap growth capital, we have a buyout big capital, but these are the area we've been missing. That's why we like to be exposure into venture capital. And Najib rightly, you know, made a comment rightly. That's you know, the new venture capital fund and GPs are not necessarily very you know, used to get a concept of let's say ESG type of, you know, the basic infrastructure, basic platform. That side, we can engage and provide the support and, you know, the expertise, our specialists engage in the first, you know, the early stage. So, which is two ways, not just only, you know, giving a financial commitment. Also, we try to help them out to make it right way and to follow the international standards. So, I think that's another sport AIIB tries to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. I think I may change the plan a little bit. I think we shortened the duration of the session by 15 minutes because we started late. Why don't we go to questions? If people in the audience have any questions, please raise your hand. We'll bring a mic over to you. Please let us know who you are and who you'd like to direct the question to.
Thank you. My name is Tariq Qatil, and I work in a startup in the e-mobility business, sustainability. But actually, my question is more on the topic on the innovations, but more in the private equity industry. And there was one of the points in the topic of the session is on innovative must for the carry and for the payback to the private equity fund in terms of stability and IRRs, but more to sustainability. So I would like you to shed more light on that link. How was that structured? And
who would you like to respond to that question?
I think maybe Mr. Sauda and maybe yourself. I don't know.
Would you like to?
Yeah.
It's a very good. It works, yeah. It's a very good question, and I think you're seeing it at all levels. So, for example, companies now are looking to do green funds and have particular targets. We've already done that. Companies have looked to do ESG specific targets. So in terms of having very clear KPIs associated with gender hiring, companies in our portfolio have done that. And to the extent that you're incorporating climate objectives in your overall fund, that of course is automatically picked up in the incentive schemes that people have. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the key is going to become, or the risk, right, is that you don't limit it just to a particular KPI, but you end up having a whole set of KPIs, and then you have to weigh which is the more important one. The moment you have to weigh, you have to have a weighting system. If you have a weighting system, you have a subjective view as to which has a bigger weight, and that creates maybe that's a good thing or a bad thing. It creates an entire new industry of experts and consultants who come up with different ways of evaluating incentive schemes and how to weight it and so on and so forth. So I think it's a great idea. I think it's important. I think people are already doing it. The question is, you want to do it in a way that is ultimately doesn't go to excesses, and so you start adding all sorts of other criteria. Today, the most important one is, of course, maximizing returns, because there is a fiduciary duty to do that. The question is how to incorporate that with everything else, and that is exactly what multilateral development organizations and others are trying to do, to find ways and mechanisms to do that that meets the requirements of investors, pensioners, as well as our own objectives, both at the fund level, at the institutional level, and then globally with the responsibility we have to take down today.
Thank you, Sadiq. Jennifer, if you'd like to add.
This is an area that we've had to focus on a lot because of the nature of our mandate. And it's important for some of our institutions, including AIIB, that we do deliver on that mandate. So in order to do that, they've chosen to incorporate outsized incentives where we are delivering on those impact targets. Not every investor in the fund wanted to do that. So for some of them, they want, and so that was fine for us. We have the ability through our systems to track the carry positioning across every LP. But for some of the LPs, it's absolutely critical because the whole reason why they're coming into impact is so specific to their organization that they run reputational risk if their impact isn't carried through into the performance, and they can't, if it's a pension fund, they can't communicate that to their members and their regulators. And so I think at the moment it's customized. I don't know if ever there will be able to be an industry standard. There's an organization called Tipping Point that's funded by Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, and a number of other philanthropic foundations At the moment, it's running a research study on impact-linked compensation. So please approach me and I can share you the details there. So they've studied 94 different GPs around the world at the moment that are using some form of sustainability and carry. They've gone into deeper analysis on 46 of them. We've really started as being doing something quite unique. But for us, it was very much because it was built between us as a GP and our LPs, rather than us deciding as GP, this is the way we're going to structure it and take it to market. So it's been quite effective in that area. And very much we see that as a case study and innovation that AIIB has brought into this area. So we're really grateful for the fact they wanted to incorporate it into our fund.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Hi, everyone. I'm Dana Barsky with Standard Chartered. Thanks. You have a cold. You mentioned with respect to due diligence how challenging it was that you weren't able to leverage the due diligence between different MDBs. And I've also seen that, frankly, between MDBs and the private sector as well. I guess I'm just going to pose a very challenging question, which is, how do we fix that? Any ideas on how we could possibly pilot programs that may try to leverage each other's work, both to save time and speed things along?
I guess that's an AIB directed question. John, would you like to respond to that?
Anyone who may have an idea.
So let me respond to that. So I can respond on behalf of AIB what we are doing. So what we are doing is we're quite actively working together with other multilateral development banks. We're co-financing with them. We're parallel financing with them. And not with all of them, but with several of them, we accept their standards. So that's the best way to start a working relationship. And over time, I guess, they'll start accepting our standards as well and make it easier for our clients. So that's the best way we can do this. Normally when an infrastructure is usually bespoke, highly structured, long gestation projects. So if a particular organization has been working on a transaction for some time, it would be difficult to try and convince them to change their approach on what they've already done. The best possible way is to try and work with what they've already done and advance the transaction. Another related issue that we face quite commonly is country-specific standards. So many of our members would like to convince development banks to follow their respective country standards. So we're working on both fronts. So we're trying to be as flexible as possible and not only work with partners, but also try and work with our members and accept as much as possible the standards that they have locally.
My sense is even institutional investors in Asia, be it the Japanese or the Koreans and so on, they're all fairly reluctant to invest in the risk return dynamics of emerging markets. Most people are comfortable primarily in the developed markets. And given what we see, the difficulties, be it currency, inflation, and so on, how would you see the risk return of what you invest in developed markets like the US versus the case for emerging markets? Is there really a case for emerging markets for those investments? Clearly, there's growth, but is the risk return really compelling for a dollarized investment?
So I'll give you a very simple statistic. Historically, over the last 10 to 15 years, I would say on a risk-adjusted basis, so literally apples to apples, incorporating FX risk, forward curves, regulatory, and so on, you can generate 600 to 800 basis points of pure alpha in high-growth economies. So that's point number one. Very simple, quantifiable answer. The second thing is, not all the idea that industrial economies have better returns than non, or let me rephrase it, have lower risk but not. Yeah, that may be an average, but you don't, unless you're buying an index, we don't invest in averages, right? So we invest in underlying investments, projects, and so on. There are countries which are AAA rated, which have significantly more risk than countries with a single B. I'll give you an example. We've invested in Indian toll roads. I'm not quite sure I would invest in some of the OECD economies or even the EU economies in toll roads, because I do not believe that the risk return is there. On the other hand, in India, the National Highway Authority of India has a 15-20-year track record of very solid regulatory framework. In fact, it was structured early on with the help of the IFC. They've stuck to it. They've been very consistent, and you have multiple foreign operators. So I think it's really on a case-by-case basis. And the fact is that over the coming 10 years, we were saying earlier, 80% of the growth of the coming 10 years is going to come from Southeast Asia. And of that, 80% is going to come essentially from urban growth. So even if you look at portfolio construction, I think it doesn't make any sense not to include emerging markets.
Thank you. I think we have just time for one last question. The gentleman over there.
Hello, my name is Ahmed Nagi. I'm representing a company working in software development. As you mentioned, here is very high demand in software development, especially in emerging markets, to outsource the remote talents from this market. So my question is a bank is planning to invest in education infrastructure in these markets, and to make sure that graduated resources will be allocated for the companies, and the companies in the stable markets like US and Europe and Asia. And my question, and the second question is there any plans to add the workflow and the productivity, how to be productive resources to be to work remote for these markets, and just thank you.
Maybe
No, I was going to say the idea of using software in a large area of infrastructure is, as we were saying, critical. I think the best example when you talk about software, you're talking about remote, is education, right? There's a huge need for education, whether it's technical, primary, and so on. And maybe Jennifer, that you can elaborate a little bit on the interaction, how effectively your business is relying more and more on technology, on software development.
Yeah, so the company that we've invested in, as I mentioned, it's an education delivery business, so they teach classes. But in order for that content to be able to be delivered across an entire country, it's really driven by having, really working off that technological infrastructure that's there. So what it's allowing to happen is to, as I mentioned, it's allowing the ability to train teachers all across the country, as well as the students, and then allow the teachers and students to be interacting constantly with each other through this platform. And what that allows you to do is have children that, for instance, in Vietnam, they might be sitting in their most remote place in Vietnam, but they can be interacting in a classroom with children that are sitting in Hanoi or in Ho Chi Minh City and working on projects together. So it's the only way that we need to leverage that type of infrastructure to be able to ensure all people in the countries are able to benefit from the dissemination of this knowledge, which is so important to the economic development.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So with that, I'd like to close the session and thank the panelists for your very thoughtful comments and insights. Thank you very much. Like to thank the audience for attending this session. Hope you enjoy the rest of the annual meeting as well. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.